Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's America Walks webinar, Climate and Age-Friendly Communities with author Danielle Arigoni. I'm Ben Crowther. I'm the Policy Director with America Walks, and I'll be running our discussion today. Next slide, please. I'm also joined by two of our board members here at America Walks, Arliss Reynolds, who in addition to being a board member is a Costa Mesa, California council member, and David Dixon, who is also with Stantec's Urban Places, running their planning and urban design program. Next slide, please. So just want to take a moment to say thank you to our sponsors of today's webinar, the Center for Disease Control's Active People Healthy Nation program, EcoCounter, and Tool Design. And I'd like to take a moment just to thank all of you as well who are joining us today. America Walks is a national nonprofit that runs on individual contributions and donations. So if you would like to donate and support our work and support webinars like these, we'll have a link in the chat available for you. And during today's webinar, we're going to hear from Danielle about her book and her work. And I'm sure all of you on here will have a lot of great questions. We want to direct those to the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen. If you put them there, they get logged where we can track them a little bit better than something like the chat. And we'll definitely have time to come back after our discussion today and answer a lot of those questions. So please, as you're listening, if something pops up in your mind that you want to ask, type it in there and we'll get it in the queue for you. So our guest today is Danielle Arigoni. She is the Managing Director for Policy and Solutions at the National Housing Trust and previously served as Director of Livable Communities at AARP, where she led efforts to help communities implement safe and walkable streets, age-friendly housing and transportation options, and greater opportunities for residents of all ages to participate in community life. She's also a former director of the Office of Economic Resilience at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So thank you, Danielle, for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit more about your work and your book.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ben. And thank you to everyone at America Walks, staff and board members, especially Mike McGinn for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be with you all. I'm going to try and get my PowerPoint going here. Hopefully it will work. Trying to get into presentation mode. I'm not sure what you all are seeing.
We're seeing the, oh, there we go. That looks
Perfect.
great.
Okay, great. Perfect. All right. Great. Well, thank you again for having me. I'm really happy to be here. I love this organization, and it's great to have you all spending the time today on this topic. I'm also really grateful to National Housing Trust for supporting me in this work. I want to give a quick, advertisement, I guess, for them. National Housing Trust is a nonprofit organization that committed to building affordable housing, particularly sustainable and resilient affordable housing across the country. We are a housing developer ourselves. We do lots of work around advocacy, which I lead, and a whole host of other things. And right now, we're really very focused on this intersection between climate resilience and housing and equity. And so while I kind of spend my days thinking about how to make affordable housing more resilient, really this talk is about broadening the lens to think a little bit more holistically at some of the climate changes and climate change risks, frankly, that we all face. We're here today specifically to talk about two concurrent and mutually impactful trends: the aging of our population and our changing climate, both of which have the potential to radically disrupt how we plan for our communities, but differ really in the degrees to which their changes are evident. For most people, but sadly, still not all, there's little doubt that climate change is real. It's here and it's impacting our daily lives. In the US and across the world, people now endure summers that are characterized by code red air quality days and winters by either too much or too little snowpack. Extreme heat and cold are becoming more common throughout the US. Hurricanes are increasingly frequent, intense, and deadly, and extreme rainfall and wildfire smoke plague parts of the country unaccustomed to such conditions. We see clear evidence of the impacts of climate change in the destruction that it leaves behind. Here in the US, NOAA tracks disasters, nearly all of which are climate fueled, that result in at least $1 billion of damage. The number of billion-dollar disasters has increased each year. Since NOAA started tracking these figures in 1980, the overall average has been 8 per year. Last year, there were 18. And as of last month, we were at 25. These disasters include the full array of wildfires, storms, flooding, hurricanes, cold waves, and droughts, and reach nearly all corners of our country. Time and time again, we see that these events of this scale lead to loss of life and the devastation of homes and communities that will, in many cases, take years to recover from. This climate trend intersects with and compounds another that is less talked about and maybe less apparent, but which will nevertheless have a tremendous impact on our communities. We are, as a country and as a world, becoming older. People over 65 are the fastest growing demographic in the US. 100 years ago, just 1 in 20 people was over 65. Today, roughly 1 in 6 is. Moreover, by 2034, there will be more people over 65 than under 18 in the US for the first time ever. And that group is increasingly diverse, with far higher growth rates of older adults among Black, Asian, and Latino populations than among white older adults. In 2021, the share of people of color within the older adult cohort was just 24%. By 2040, that will increase to 34%. This change represents a significant tipping point among a sizable share of our population, and yet it frankly doesn't get the media coverage or discussion that it deserves. As a result, many community leaders, planners, and advocates are left with a poor understanding of what this shift means and what older adults' needs are. Part of the problem is that we lack a standard definition of who is an older adult. Is it when your invitation comes to join AARP, or when you qualify for the 55 plus retirement community, or when you start collecting Social Security at 62, or Medicare at 65, or something else? Our poor understanding is exacerbated by the fact that we live in a youth-obsessed culture, where any mention of aging is usually accompanied by the word anti in front of it, as well as by the fact that older adults continue to break the mold and shatter images of what it means to age. We see people running marathons in their late 80s. We saw Martha Stewart grace the cover of Sports Illustrated. And of course, we have the oldest sitting US president in history. Older adults continue to defy expectations and stretch the boundaries of what it means to age. But there are some inherent truths to aging when looking across the cohort, which are not very well understood by the general populace. 1 in 6 live in poverty. 96% live independently outside of congregate facilities. Nearly 30% live alone, and 20% don't drive. 1 in 9 live with Alzheimer's disease or another form of cognitive decline. 20% need help with activities of daily living, such as seeing, hearing, communicating, or self-care. 40% have ambulatory limitations, and 80% live with 2 or more chronic medical conditions. It's a shortfall for all of us when we fail to acknowledge these realities and let them inform how we guide our work, especially when we aim to create safer places for all people to walk and roll. So we have these 2 massive trends underway, each of which has its own set of institutions that work to address them. Engineers, data analysts, climatologists, emergency managers are working diligently to plan for the impacts of climate change, while gerontologists, demographers, healthcare professionals, and aging advocates are planning for an older, grayer future. That division of labor is often mirrored in public agencies that are similarly siloed. One set to manage public works and regulate utilities and emergency response, and a different set charged with promoting health and healthy aging. Therein lies the problem. 2 or more siloed approaches are responsible for tackling what are each complex problems without a full understanding of how they intersect and compound. As a result, there's too little attention paid to the intersection between climate risks and an aging population, and not enough focus on how and where climate change exacerbates risk for older adults, and what that means for communities that are home to an increasingly large share of them. You see the same level of inattention to the needs of older adults in how we build our communities. Most communities lack adequate benches in parks and fail to provide seating and shading at bus stops. Rarely do they provide enough safe, affordable housing that's also accessible, or enough reliable, accessible, affordable choice in how to get around once a person stops driving. Certainly, they aren't creating places that are safe for older pedestrians. In many cases, pedestrians of any age. The 2022 Dangerous by Design report by Smart Growth America reports that older adults were struck and killed at much higher rates than other populations in 2020. There's a lot of work to be done to make communities more livable and age-friendly, and a lot of good work is underway, largely through AARP's Livable Communities program and the 800 plus states and communities that are part of the Age-Friendly Network, all of which aim to create places that work better for people of all ages and all abilities. A few resources in particular that I think are useful and relevant to our discussion and to you all are the Walk Audit Toolkit and the Bike Toolkit, both of which can help communities become places that are safer for people walking, rolling, and biking. The State Walking College report is another product that's, I think, particularly useful, and I think one that I have invested pride in because it began as a partnership between AARP and America Walks while I was there. But really the lessons of that partnership and collaboration now live on in the form of lessons learned that can help advocates support better built environment changes that meet the needs for older adults in light of their mobility preferences and challenges. And there's a lot of good work and partnership continuing between the two organizations, which is wonderful. But there's so much more to do, truly, in order to create places that are safe for older adults and that allow people to age safely in place. And nowhere is that more apparent than when you think about the impacts of climate change and climate-fueled disasters. Certainly among the largest named disasters, the ones that occupy our collective memory, we see the older adults bear the brunt. Hurricane Katrina, California Camp Fire, heat domes that covered the Pacific Northwest, Winter Storm Uri, Hurricane Ian, and more recently, the Lahaina wildfires. For nearly 2 decades, hurricanes, winter storms, wildfires, and extreme temperatures claim a far greater share of older adults' lives relative to the fact that they represent roughly 20% of the population. Older adults die at double, triple, or quadruple the rate as people who are younger. This trend line and the fact that it remains virtually unchanged over 20 years makes it painfully clear that we are failing to create communities that safeguard older adults in their times of greatest need. It's not like we haven't been told this was happening. News stories almost consistently reported on the tragedies, but we haven't made it a priority to reverse this 20-year trend. We could spend a lot of time talking about why this is. I think it's a tragic blend of ageism, ableism, and denial about how climate change is likely to truly affect our lives. And it certainly is also a byproduct of the siloed approach to problem solving that I described before. But I think the question that we should more urgently ask is, what can we do about it? For me, I felt that I could make a contribution by diving deep into the topic, ultimately sharing my perspective in the form of a book, Climate Resilience for an Aging Nation. Drawing on lessons learned throughout my career and even more learned during my year of research, I finally landed on 3 big takeaways. First, we have to be clear-eyed in our understanding about how climate change is impacting older adults and accept that they, in many cases, are more impacted. This has to start with more commitment to understanding who older adults are and what their needs are. Older adults are a varied group in ages and abilities, and more racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse every year. Imagine for a moment the difference in climate-related needs faced by a healthy, engaged, financially secure 62-year-old compared by those of an 89-year-old living alone in substandard housing with chronic medical challenges and no savings, or a grandparent living comfortably in an intergenerational home with their child and her family, compared to one who's caretaking for an adult child with a disability or a spouse with dementia. It's essential to understand the financial, health, caregiving, housing, and mobility conditions faced by older adults first, in order to best understand how they intersect with and amplify their climate risks. Second, we need to recognize that individual and even institutional preparedness is not enough. One conclusion that I reached from my research is that these tragic lives lost aren't often the result of a failure of individuals to prepare. More often, they're the result of unrealistic expectations about what it means to be prepared for someone who lives on a fixed income, or who cares for a homebound family member, or who can't drive. They are also the result of systems-wide failures that impact the whole community, but especially older adults, and therefore must be dealt with at the community scale. Third, these and other reasons are why it becomes essential to work towards community-wide resilience. That means that all sectors and all disciplines have a role to play. Aging advocates, housing advocates, transportation planners, healthcare providers, utilities, and many more. This is no longer a job for any one sector or profession. It is a job for all of us. Furthermore, I believe that it is the job for all of us. After all, we all have older adults in our lives whom we love, and we all presumably hope to live in a community ourselves where we will be safe and secure in the face of a changing climate as we age. We are not on a path at the moment to create such communities. Therefore, we must redouble our efforts to build community scale resilience. So what does it mean to build a more resilient community? I'm an urban planner, so when I think about what's needed to achieve resilience, naturally my mind, maybe yours, goes first to public systems, policies, and infrastructure improvements. That means things like hard infrastructure, seawalls, and levees to protect communities, more green infrastructure to better manage flooding, and a more resilient grid that can withstand extreme conditions and keep the power on. But it also means more resilient housing construction, especially in age-targeted housing, stronger building codes, and zoning reform. Resilience would include policies that encourage smaller, denser housing that reduces utilities and cultivates a social network that can help in times of disaster. Community resilience would also deliver a diverse transportation network that includes public transit and fosters safe biking, walking, and rolling to provide affordable and reliable options for the roughly 1 in 5 people over 65 who don't drive. That creates both redundancy in how people access services and how health can be delivered, but also helps to mitigate one of the largest sources of carbon emissions. But community resilience would also include multiple modes of communicating about disasters, keeping in mind the significant share of older adults who aren't internet savvy, or who live with disabilities, or who speak a language other than English. Many of these are core good planning principles, but not all. Many of them also deliver climate mitigation benefits, but not all. But regardless, they need to be considered as critical elements of any community-wide climate resilience plan. And with a broader definition of climate resilience, so too do we need a broader array of sectors and diverse partnerships to achieve this future. Utilities, for example, can be partners in implementing payment systems that lower the seasonal cost spikes that cause older adults to go without cooling and heating. They can encourage greater energy efficiency in homes and the use of renewable energy and battery storage. Healthcare professions can proactively address the issue of climate change in the course of medical care so that older adults and their caregivers better understand the risks of longer, hotter seasons or poor air quality days, especially as they relate to underlying health conditions. Home health aides can be trained to help their clients better prepare for climate-related risks and identify interventions in the home, like backup power generators or air purifiers that make older adults safer. Emergency managers and climate resilience planners can more explicitly incorporate aging in their planning, not just for older adults who live in facilities, but for the 96% of them who live in the community, often alone. They can plug into ongoing age-friendly planning efforts at the local and regional scale, and they can serve as a resource and as leaders to advocate for better housing, transportation, and infrastructure solutions that are grounded in the realities of climate-related risks. Finally, aging advocates can recognize that climate change is central to their work. They can educate and train their industry and integrate climate considerations more routinely into the programs and policies that they implement to serve older adults. They can make themselves known to other sectors as experts and establish relationships that cultivate a greater understanding of and consideration for older adults. When these and other disciplines center their work around how to reduce climate change risk for older adults, we create safer and more resilient places for all. I hope that this has piqued your interest in learning more about this issue. I look forward to our conversation, but I will say that the book, in addition to the highlights that I talked about there, it includes 3 case studies, roughly 25 solutions across housing, transportation, utilities, and more that help communities advance climate resilience through an aging lens. Thank you so much for your time and attention to this matter, because when we solve the needs of older adults, we also solve for the needs of people on limited incomes, or who can't drive, or who live with disabilities. We solve for those who are often overlooked and not heard because they are isolated, either by choice or circumstance. We also serve the needs of our future selves by creating systems community-wide that better account for our changing abilities, needs, and risks as we age. Thank you.
Thanks, Danielle. I'd like to invite Arliss and David to join us on screen, who have been doing their homework and have been reading the book, and I think would give it rave reviews based off some of our earlier conversations. Um, for those of you listening out there, if you do have questions, now is a great time to put them in the Q&A so we can get those in the queue. But I know Arliss and David have a few questions of their own based on their reading to start.
This is David Dixon, Danielle, also a planner, so appreciate having the fellowship here. I'm also the only person on this screen who qualifies as older, at least in my eyes. So thank you.
See, it depends on the definition. I'm gonna say.
I think by many definitions, but that is anyway. So I appreciate the attention. I was going to ask a very different question, but in listening to you, one came immediately to mind. I had the great privilege and real honor of working with folks in New Orleans on recovery planning and then leading the post-Katrina master plan for New Orleans. And one of the issues that came up most often, and let me say was by far the most difficult issue to address, was relocation versus protection in place. And this was particularly difficult for lower income neighborhoods, for older neighborhoods, and for older low income neighborhoods. And among the many issues that folks would raise, because if they lived there, they didn't want to move, was where are we going to go in the first place? No one's holding their arms out and saying, come live in my neighborhood. But beyond that, there are informal social safety networks here that are really important to us. Somebody looks out for us. We watch their kids. There's a kid down the block who's got substance abuse problems and we help him, all these kinds of things. And I came to the conclusion, so I'm sorry, this is going to be a conclusion framed as a question to you, that in the end, it's a lot less expensive and certainly more humane to protect neighborhoods, not just housing, not just fortify housing, but to fortify neighborhoods in place. And I would love your take on this, because I think it's certainly still a very open question.
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the thorniest questions that we have as a world, frankly, when it comes to adapting to climate change. And I'm going to get I think it's Jakarta, Indonesia, which is moving its capital entirely inland, right? It's a massive undertaking. So it's not just the US that struggles with these challenges. And frankly, there are other places that are even at more urgent risk than some American cities are. I want to say, this is not to say that people should not consider relocation. Relocation absolutely has its place. I think there's some places that are untenable, frankly, barrier islands and the like. But I will mirror back to you some of what I heard in New Orleans as well, which is that in one of the case studies that I write about in the book is New Orleans. And they kind of pointed to a pivot point in their reaction and their response to disasters, which had been where once the answer had been evacuate, which is different than relocation, but not unrelated. They kind of came to the conclusion that being able to shelter in place is better, particularly when you think about the needs of older adults. Again, I don't want to say that relocation or evacuation is bad. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is New Orleans concluded that there are a lot of benefits to helping people be able to shelter in place, and that warranted an entirely different set of strategies than they had been contemplated before. So it's not that transportation challenges go away. They just morph into something different. But there's an example that I learned about, and it illustrates really well what you're talking about, which is kind of those social networks that allow people to thrive. There's an example that I talk about in my book of an older gentleman who was evacuated after, I want to say Hurricane Katrina, I might have gotten the event wrong, to Houston. He lived with mild dementia. He was living on his own in New Orleans. He could get around on the bus. He knew where things were. People looked out for him. He was evacuated to Houston, where there was no public transit, where he didn't have those social networks, where he had to kind of start all over again. And that precipitated a very rapid decline in his well-being and his health, such that he ended up in a nursing home. With the cost of nursing homes these days, people do everything they can to stay out of them for lots of reasons, not just cost. But the degree to which we can help people age safely in place and prepare for these community scale impacts that are going to happen, like the power going down, like transportation networks being disrupted. The more we can anticipate those and create safety nets, if you will, mechanisms to keep people safe in place,
Yes.
the better it is for many older adults. There have been several studies that talked about, the interruption of medical care, routine medical care, the psychological impact of relocation and evacuation, both of which have been tied very clearly to higher mortality rates for older adults.
Mm-hmm.
So very long-winded way of saying, yes, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
And that it nevertheless is a very individualized or very localized, I guess, decision about being honest about the needs that you
Mm-hmm.
confront as a community and what are the full array of options to keep people safe.
Yeah. One thing you reminded very quickly, and then Arliss, I'll turn this over to you, is the issue of New Orleans East, which was an older neighborhood, but it was also, how do I say this, a sort of upper middle class Black neighborhood, and untenable without a great deal of protection. There was a lot of big push to move it. And these folks said, how on earth are we going to create another kind of upper middle class Black neighborhood for folks like us? You can't recreate these places that we've taken decades to create.
Generations, right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. I love your answer.
Sure.
Arliss.
Yeah, I'll jump in on a related question. I really appreciate that you have a chapter focused on, what are the strategies, right? And thank you for explaining the why this is important. And I have a question on that I'll bring up later. But among the strategies, and you described a few in your presentation, there seems to be clear lines for who is responsible, right? You mentioned utilities, you mentioned housing, you mentioned transportation. As a local government official, it's kind of clear, okay, like I know the agency responsible for making those decisions. Can you talk about social infrastructure and sort of what that is and how you build it and who is responsible or who is most effective in building social infrastructure?
Such a good question. That's a great question. And I think that speaks to your perspective as a local official, right? Where you're like, who's tasked to make sure that people are engaged and informed? How do we get the word out? It's really critically important. And I think when it works really well, people don't notice it. But when it doesn't work, it's very obvious. Like you really see the effects of it. I'll give probably an incomplete answer, which is to say for older adults, there are a few component parts to this. I think, first of all, social infrastructure is supported by the built environment, obviously, right? If people are in closer proximity to one another, if there are more sort of chance interactions that can take place going to the mailbox or walking to the grocery store or taking your dog for a walk, that contributes to social infrastructure. So to the park benches and gathering places that sort of attract people and keep them there in ways that they can interact with one another. So that's one way to enhance social infrastructure. But from like a programmatic standpoint, I think about, the Area Agency on Aging being a really important part. And I'll be honest, I'm an urban planner, right? I have 2 degrees in planning. I've worked in planning for decades now. I didn't really fully understand the role of the Area Agency on Aging until I began to work at AARP and until I became acquainted with the work of the age-friendly communities there that we supported. The Area Agency on Aging is the hub for many, many services that meet the needs of older adults, everything from Meals on Wheels to transportation to social engagement and sort of culture and education and social opportunities. The Area Agency on Aging is a little bit like this Swiss Army knife of services that pertain to older adults that people don't necessarily think about or know about until they reach the age where they need those services. So I would say area agencies on aging play a very important part in creating that social infrastructure. The thing about that is that's often a county level function. So you think about how a county creates a structure to support its older adults, and then how does that intersect with the cities within that county or with the unincorporated areas within that county? It becomes this balancing act of who's on first and who's in charge of what and who communicates with whom, which is, I think, exactly part of the gap is part of the problem that we see being evidenced in a lack of connectedness among older adults. If the city doesn't understand how the county is connecting with their older adults, then the city's missing a chance to engage older adults in decision making around climate resilience or the like. Because many area agencies on aging are not at the planning table. They're not invited to be a part of conversations about climate resilience or the built environment. So you kind of have to forge these connections between these disparate communities. I'll give a quick plug for the Age Friendly Network that is run by AARP, which is built on the model by World Health Organization. That planning framework is the forum, is a really fantastic way to bring those disparate interests together to identify and assess how we're doing from a social infrastructure standpoint. Do we create enough opportunities to communicate with older adults in ways that they need and in ways that work for them? How do we craft these intergenerational opportunities that we know enrich the lives of older adults and make their lives more rich and dynamic and engaged, and tap into those volunteer talents that they have, while also building some of that social infrastructure that really is important across generations. So those are a few thoughts, I guess, on that.
Yeah. Great. I'll jump into to one other, which was I think your opening comments on really the diversity of the older community. So I shared in a previous conversation that, you know, as a millennial elected, right, often what I saw was only older people at the discussion table, right? They're traditionally maybe overrepresented at the voting box, at our local government meetings. And so I realized in reading your book that I've been so focused on engaging all of the other groups, right? Which I'll maintain is still important. But your book really got me thinking, who is this population of older adults that we are missing, right, and not planning for? And so I'd love to hear your advice on how a local government or another agency or a community interested in taking up some of these solutions really defines and understands that that population of older adults who may not be kind of showing up at the regular local meetings.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to slip into a mode where, and I think this is a challenge for all elected officials to remind themselves that it's not just the people who show up at the meetings who they represent. You know, it's all those people who are working 3 jobs, who can't get daycare for their child, and who can't show up, or frankly, who don't have the physical mobility or the means to get to the meeting to express their wishes. So I think in that same vein, you know, in many cases there are older adults who are very, you know, vocal at community meetings and can be perceived as being impediments to change in some case. I think particularly there's a little bit of a trope, frankly, about older adults who don't want to see their community change and who resist, you know, I'll speak to my own community, resist zoning change. You know, God forbid we allow something other than single family zoning to exist, because this is what makes our community so special and so unique. We have to hold on to that. I think I really do believe that that's like a sliver of people. There's a much more complex and rich sort of population behind that. And I think particularly when you think about the racial and ethnic diversity that we're seeing in the older adult population, and when you think about the number of older adults who live alone or who don't drive, and you start to peel back the layers of whose voices we aren't hearing, I think that does beget a very different kind of conversation. And I think age-friendly planning efforts can be a really important way to do that, because they do bring kind of a diverse array of interests to the planning table. But like with anything, it takes intentionality. It takes, you know, a focused effort to hear from people who aren't just the ones who show up at the city council meeting or the commission or the zoning meeting to oppose change, and to create opportunities to educate them about it. And I think, you know, particularly on climate resilience, it's not you know, a myth to say that maybe there are a higher number of older adults are skeptical of climate change, or maybe don't perceive that as being as much of an urgent matter as younger populations do. There's surveys that show that. But still, the majority of older adults are concerned about climate change and do want to engage in problem solving and being part of the solution. And I think it always comes back to education and helping people connect the dots between their quality of life, their ability to age in place, their ability to preserve the equity in their home if they're a homeowner, and the risks that they're going to confront with this new climate future that we've got coming our way. So the more we can engage people, the more we can be intentional in bringing diverse voices to the table, I think the better off we're going to all be.
Yeah.
So I think I'm sort of picking up on what you're both talking about, but I want to sort of reverse the equation from climate to older folks to me. No. So one of the things I really appreciate about your book, and for everyone who's listening, it is fascinating to read. It is fun. fun might not be the word, but you're certainly going to be engaged. It's also very important because it's the only book I've come across that reminds all of us we are an aging nation and gets us to start thinking about the implications. So one of the things I did after reading about the first 4 pages was go look up census data and discovered that more than 60% of our net population growth for the next 20 years is going to be folks over 65. And from my perspective as a planner, we are not prepared in, let alone disaster preparedness in terms of housing. In our housing stock is still 62% single family detached. In terms of medical care and how expensive it is when some of us get sick for everybody. In terms of mobility, in terms of the fact that the area where the older population, whatever we want to call it, those of us over 65 are growing fastest is actually in suburbs rather than cities, which have the much less capacity in terms of social services and folks who are thinking about the kinds of things you are, Danielle. So this is a long preamble to say, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot here, how do you think we can, we worry so much about issues that are probably far less impactful than the fact that we are aging and so rapidly. How are we going to start making this issue number even 5 on the list, let alone 1? Sorry to surprise you here.
Yeah, thanks for the softball question. I think that's exactly the challenge is how do we get people to pay attention to this and care? And I think we're all very selfishly motivated. I think that's human traits. I think we start thinking about it more when we've got an older parent that we start to worry about, or when we have a spouse that we see is for some reason, ill in ways that deliver a very different type of mobility than that person has ever been forced to live with before. Like any number of changes in the family, in your friend group, in the community where you live can spark that kind of a thoughtfulness. I guess I will say that we planners have a responsibility to be honest about what we are planning for and who we are planning for, and to do the work that you just did, which is to say, where is our population growth? And not just ascribe that as like, okay, got it, I checked the box, I know that now we're at 62% growth in older adults, but to really understand what that means. And I'll be honest, I have been surprised myself to learn some of the things that I've learned, that nearly 30% of older adults live alone, and that's higher for women than for men. 1 in 5 older adults don't drive. And David, you and I were speaking yesterday, one of the great statistics that ARP has put out for years now is that many older adults outlive their ability to drive by anywhere from 7 to 10 years. So if you take for granted that you're going to drive until your final day on this earth, guess again, you're probably not. And so whenever we're advocating for public transit or walkable communities or bike lanes or any of those other transportation options, think of it for the very life-giving nature that it means for older adults, for whom that is their only way to get groceries and to live independently and safely. And you touched on the cost of nursing homes. It's prohibitively expensive.
It actually is, yes.
And the more that we can equip people to age in their home, I mean, frankly, this is a financial planning decision too. Like, how do you create communities that will allow your money and your savings, however limited it may be, to go stretch as far as you can? Well, then create communities where you have housing choice, create communities where you have transportation options, create communities where there is that social infrastructure, whether it's through the Area Agency on Aging or through volunteer groups like Villages, where those exist to help you age in place. Because that's going to be the thing that I think starts to tilt the conversation. I will again give lots of credit to ARP and wave as a point of pride the fact that ARP has been a real leader in trying to change the conversation around housing options by putting out the book ABCs to ADU, the ABCs of ADUs, and making the case that accessory dwelling units and zoning change belong in age-friendly communities. That changes the conversation then, because now you're being able to paint a picture for older adults of some of those housing choices that they might not yet have contemplated, but they might need to make. And what really would it look like if we were to create a community that worked for older adults? It would create choices in where people live so they could age in their community, downsize when they want to. Guess what? That also happens to deliver housing that's more that's more energy efficient, smaller footprint, higher density, greater social network. All these good smart growth and planning principles that we've been espousing for decades can be served by an age-friendly lens that brings it home for people in ways that they can begin to resonate with and relate to.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Just thinking about what you're saying, we look at the issue of affordable housing so much through the lens of a family of four living under the poverty line, when in fact a very substantial share of that, not that we shouldn't, but are older folks. I remember reading,
oh my gosh,
somewhere that 70% of folks when they turn 65 want to sell their single family house and move to a walkable environment where they can live in multifamily housing they don't have to take care of. And not only is majority of our housing single family detached, but because the housing market generally is shifting so much toward households without kids, the few housing options we have that are multifamily, mixed-use, walkable environments have become very, very expensive. And listening to you, I realize there's a whole new reason to really introduce a generation of ADUs and mixed-income housing in urban areas, because that's where the fastest growing part of our population needs, not just wants to live, but needs to live. And I'm sorry, you're the one we're interviewing, but I'll stop here. But and just thinking about Arliss's question, your comments about isolation. You may live alone if you at least live in a walkable neighborhood within a 5-minute walk of places to shop and eat. You have a chance.
Yeah.
But we are literally sentencing people to much less healthy lifestyles. So to turn this into a question. One of the things that has really struck me just doing planning for suburbs is how rapidly suburbs are actually becoming poorer and older, and that this is where the largest number of folks over 65 are appearing. And if you have any comments on how suburbs are just institutionally unable, they can't support planning departments, let alone plan for disaster preparedness, et cetera. How you see our ability, maybe as regions or counties, whatever, to really plan in the ways you're talking about for the majority of folks who need this planning.
Yeah, I mean, I take some heart in the fact that we've seen zoning change really sweep the country. Just this week, Alexandria, Virginia, near me, legislated to regulate, passed a law that banning single family zoning. That is, we're starting to see the dominoes fall, right, in communities that are recognizing that single family zoning, not only is it not the solution, it's actually part of the problem. And so I think that is going to be one of the greatest fixes that suburbs can bring upon themselves, is to sort of get caught up in the wave of zoning reform so that you can begin to gently diversify the housing stock there and create more housing options for people who live there. I think we're also in a unique point of time with interest rates being what they are. People are very reluctant to sell their homes, which has kind of frozen the housing market a little bit. But ideally, what you want to be able to do is give people choice in where they live. And if they love that suburb where they've raised their kids and don't want to leave, great. Then make sure that there are multifamily homes that are available to them, or accessory dwelling units that they can move into. And that's how you begin to change the conversation, because when you can build the population density, then you can support public transit better, you can support, local businesses and mixed uses and all these good things. So I've got good hope for zoning reform that can be a big part of how we start to fix the suburbs.
Thank you. And then one more quick editorial comment, and then Arliss, back to you. As a planner, I've been involved in a number of ADU initiatives, and I will just report that those, not just ones I've been engaged in, but heard about, have all been successful. That there is probably less opposition armed with information and an understanding that all those single family houses will still look like single family houses, that neighborhoods can be much more are much more readily persuaded or come to understand the benefits to them, the enlightened self-interest of supporting ADU initiatives. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, agreed.
Sorry.
We have some really fantastic questions coming through the chat. So I'm going to pass it over to Ben to share some of the chat questions.
Yeah, thanks, Arliss. Yeah, we got a great number here. Some really interesting questions. A lot of questions from advocates on how they can better support in their own community, being able to have older adults be able to get around and be able to continue to live in their communities. And so I'll start with this question. maybe this is building a little bit off the previous conversation here. Are there particular places in the United States that you'd point to that are doing this well, doing housing support well? And what elements do you think need to be there, right, to support housing for older adults?
Mm-hmm. I'll perhaps predictably, I'll point to Portland, Oregon. So Portland, Oregon is the poster child for lots of good things, and I'm afraid that they are the case here too. But I'll pull on them as an example for reasons, not just because they've had an urban growth boundary for 50 years, and not just because they legislated zoning change across the whole state, a couple of years ago, and not just because they're really driving forward on missing middle housing, and densification basically in Portland, but also because they do so with the focus of older adults at the center. And Portland was one of the first cities to join the age-friendly network with World Health Organizations 15 years ago, something like that, and use that as kind of the infrastructure to graft a whole bunch of really long-term work around, including what I think was ultimately sort of an important pivot point was this connection with the county. So I earlier spoke about the fact that the Area Agency on Aging resides at the county. So too does the emergency management function in many places. It lives at the county level, not the city level. So when City of Portland and Multnomah County were able to come together and recognize that they have this sort of shared purpose of creating a safer, more resilient place for older adults, they were able to sort of leverage both of their respective functions in ways that kind of 1 + 1 = 3. And I'll give a good example, I think, of how they responded to one climate crisis in particular, which was the heat waves in the Pacific Northwest in 2021, where this incredibly fatal heat dome camped out over the Pacific Northwest for many, many days, killed 1,000 people in the most impacted county, Multnomah County. The average age of people who died was 67. So again, disproportionately impacted older adults. They utilized this infrastructure that they had crafted to respond to COVID, frankly, where they were able to sort of use community-based organizations to get supports and information to older adults. They kind of repurposed some of that infrastructure to get heat pumps out to older adults, particularly low-income older adults after the heat wave, which was helpful because guess what? The following summer was a repeat event in many regards, but the death rate was far lower for lots of reasons. So I think by being intentional about a desire to serve the needs of older adults, by setting up the sort of partnerships and networks that allow for services to be delivered to older adults to help them through whatever crisis, whether it's COVID or heat waves, they were able to get housing related solutions out into the hands of low income older adults in ways that really help them and help the whole community become more resilient to climate change.
And just follow-up questions. I think I'll combine a few here. Let's say you're outside that government power structure, or the place you're living, the community you are, isn't doing a great job right now. We have a number of folks who are working with local nonprofits on the call, a number of folks who are working with local community organizations. And how can they best make the case or advocate for increasing climate resilience for aging populations in the places they live?
I would say it starts with education. It starts with having these conversations at the community level about, I'll say this, there are more tools available now than there ever have been before to help people and advocates identify their climate risks. You can go to the FEMA risk map and you could map out the census tract level, at the county level, what are the climate risks that your community is facing. You can take that data and do some analysis about who are the older adults in our community and what are the needs that they have, and host a community conversation on how do we square those two realities, because we're going to have more older adults and we're going to have more climate risks. So let's project out a few years and say, these are the challenges we face today. What might that look like in 5-10 years? And is our housing, are the housing developments in our pipeline the right kind of housing products that we need? Are the transportation investments we're making today, are they delivering us to a more resilient future? And if they're not, then that's where you press from an advocacy perspective on local officials to do better and to do differently. But it has to start with education. Back to what we talked about at the top, I think, a lot of these issues just are not, the aging of our communities is not something that most elected officials and certainly not most local news outlets are talking about. It's not a sexy topic. It's not something that leads off the community meeting. But we only harm ourselves by not acknowledging that and by frankly embracing it. This is not a challenge to be overcome. It's an opportunity to think about who we are as a community and how we construct a built environment that can support who we are now and who we're going to be. So I would say lean in on the education, the convenings, the gatherings, do book clubs, do talks, start to get the conversation going, because that can then put pressure on the local officials.
I can jump in here. One question in the chat here that struck me and builds on, Danielle, what you were just describing is especially for advocates of walkability, folks who are really trying to push for multimodal transportation options in cities. Often the conversation of older adults comes up as an opposition to that, right? And so someone describes that older age and disability is often used as a reason not to push for wider sidewalks and takeaway lanes, right? Not to take away from car access. Mm-hmm. So I know in your book, you describe some very specific reasons that like we need to have those options, but can you just elaborate on a few of those? How would you respond to someone who says we need to make sure that seniors can get in cars and drive places?
Yeah, I don't think it's a one or the other thing. I think it's both, right? We're not. I don't think that anybody would imagine that tomorrow the perfect outcome is to eliminate cars in suburbs, and therefore everybody has to bike or walk or take buses.
Right.
That I don't think anybody's proposing that. I don't think anybody's suggesting that. What we are saying is we have to have a more equitable distribution of options, and we have to have more choice for people, and that means, frankly, upending some of those expectations that we have around parking and parking minimums, parking access, and all of that. But I think it can be done in a way that hits both marks. I know here in Washington, D.C., where my office is, perennially there are battles over bike lanes and parking, particularly, I don't mean to out churches, but particularly in front of churches where, churches in some corridors have really opposed parking bike lanes in front of their houses of worship because it interferes with parishioners' ability to access services. They've found workarounds. There are solutions to be gleaned here. There's lots of creative design solutions that can be brought to bear, but I'll come back to, it comes back to education. It comes back to really bringing people to the table so they feel like they have a voice, they feel like they've been heard, and that we're able to square all of these needs against one another. Because I think solving one or three people's parking problem is not what's in service of the whole community, but we also don't want to sort of ignore those realities either.
I do a quick just follow up there. Most of us don't stop to think about the fact that it costs $10,000 to $15,000 a year on average to own and operate a car. You can't possibly spend half that much if you have access to transit, or you'd have to take an awful lot of buses every day. And so while there is a sense that older folks or there is some reality to the fact that cars have a real place. I'm not going to wander down that road, but we tend to ignore the fact that for an awful lot of folks it is cost prohibitive to be car dependent, and that particularly in suburbs, when older folks around affordability issues are forced out to suburbs to find affordable housing, they are often automatically isolated because they can't afford, even if physically they could, to own and operate a car, and particularly if there are two of them. And on that note, Ben, do you have more questions you want to?
I think we've talked a lot about suburban settings, and we've talked a lot about urban settings. But what about strategies for supporting aging populations in rural settings?
Yeah, it already many rural places are the locations where there's a higher preponderance of older adults. So that future that we have in terms of demographic change, it is already the case in many rural places where there are more older adults than children. So they're kind of at the leading edge of our challenge in some ways, and I think the solutions that can be put in place in rural places can be instructive to the rest of us. Some of the housing challenges I think are a little different in rural places than they are in urban centers. I think in rural places, it's not so much about it's not necessarily about housing affordability. It might be about housing quality. How do you ensure that housing can be made accessible, can be built and renovated in ways that ensure that it remains safe for people to live in for the long haul, and getting supports to people who stay in rural places? How do you ensure that they can age well? I will say Maine is a great example of this. It's a highly rural state. It's also the place where volunteer driver programs emerge as a solution, where you're able to pull together volunteers who can help rural older adults get to where they need to go because they participate in volunteer driver programs. Things like villages that I mentioned before, which are these sort of community-based volunteer networks that can help people with basic services, whether it's transportation or changing a light bulb or get delivering groceries. All of those kind of volunteer led efforts work really well in rural places where there's a really high level of sort of volunteerism and civic commitment. So it's not that it's easy in rural places. I'm not going to say that, but I do think that the sort of spirit of volunteerism there is strong, and that has been a breeding ground for a lot of really innovative solutions.
Yeah, so Arliss and David, do you have any final questions for Danielle here?
Well, I'll jump in. There was one I noticed. There seems to be, I think, a few comments related to the framing aging in place. And I want to read the comment exactly. So it says, this term fails to identify and incentivize the active role older adults have in the community and economy. Have you, I just realized that I had said seniors, and I think we're saying older adults now, and you described that in the book. So is aging in place? Have you heard of other frames for that?
What I interpret from that question, or what I hear in that question, is an acknowledgement that it's not a static mode, that it's not just like, let's remain static and stationary. It's how do you create a way for people to remain in their home in a way that works for them and allows them sort of independence, mobility, but also allows them to be engaged in their community through, they have available transportation to them. They have opportunities to be involved. I think all of those attributes really are what people seek when they aim to age in place. They want to be in places where they can contribute, where they have a sense of purpose. They feel connected to other people. To me, all of those are embedded in the term aging in place. But I think what the commenter was remarking upon is that maybe that wasn't explicit. So I appreciate that question.
Yeah. As opposed to aging somewhere else, right?
Yeah. I mean, frankly, wherever one ages, one wants to feel a sense of purpose and engaged and all of that. Yes. But I think, particularly for people who feel very connected to the place where they've lived for a long time, and for whether for financial reasons or for social reasons or for any other reason, want to remain there. How do you do that in a way that makes it work?
And particularly as one ages, one loses other identities, one's job, one's family, former family status as a parent, et cetera. One thing I just wanted to sort of finish with, and I was just starting to think of as I've listened to you and to Arliss's questions and some of the other questions, done a lot of work with public housing, and there's a lot of money to create elderly public housing developments. And generally, when you talk to folks who live in public housing, they say that's the last place they want to live because they're often grandmothers taking care of kids. They very much want younger folks there to help them, and they don't want to feel labeled and isolated, as we've just said. And it just struck me that that's a real microcosm from those in many ways most in need, often of color, older, and in poverty. Sort of a poster for what I think all older folks really care about. And I think I look forward to your next book, since you seem to be the only one really writing about what could be the no pun intended issue of our age here. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, so let's all of us can give a little virtual round of applause for Danielle. And thank you, David and Arliss, for being such great co-hosts here. We do have, I know we had a lot of questions about getting where you can get the book. So I think we have a slide that will give us a little bit more of that information again, and we'll put it in the wrap up for this webinar as well.
Thanks. I will say, yeah, you can get it on Amazon. I would encourage you to purchase it from Island Press. They're a nonprofit publisher that does a lot of great work, and I'd love to throw money their way, but you can get it on Amazon at your local bookstore as well. Thank you.
I'm going to this is the first webinar I've been on where there are 25 questions still waiting in line. So you clearly
sorry we didn't get to you,
but you've raised a lot of interest. So
great.
Yes, Well, thanks everyone. Yeah, and enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you at our next webinar in January.
Thanks, everyone.